You can pray in tongues and interpret your tongue. That's not just for the church assembly. I admit that the number one use of 1 Corinthians 14 is talking about how tongues, the gift of speaking in tongues, should operate in a church assembly. But Paul also said things in 1 Corinthians 14 like, I speak in tongues more than you all, more than everyone added together. And yet he said, in the church I'd rather speak 5 words with my understanding than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. So it wasn't in the church that he did all of this. He was also talking about tongues, how it operates in our private life, and so it's not limited to that. Yes, if there is a message in the church, it needs to be interpreted, but you can also, if you pray in tongues, you can pray that you interpret it. And this wisdom that your spirit is speaking, the part of you that has the mind of Christ, you can interpret it. God can speak through you and tell you things. This is how I get a tremendous amount of revelation. I pray in tongues a lot and ask God to interpret, and God supernaturally shows me things. He gives me creative ideas. He gives me ways of doing things that wouldn't happen otherwise. This building that we were talking about, the property and stuff, the Lord started in the early part of 2009, and as I prayed in tongues, I just had an expectancy that, man, it's time to grow again. Something's going to happen. The Lord was showing me things to come. I prayed in tongues and believed, and then I had a meeting with Oral Roberts that lit my fuse and helped me. I came back, and as I prayed in tongues, things just started happening. I thought it could have taken a year or two, and within a week, we had come to the conclusion, and God had done this, and things just worked supernaturally. But the Holy Spirit was an important part of all of that, and praying in tongues. You know, when I first experienced this was over in Arlington, Texas. When I first got baptized in the Holy Spirit, I would just spend 2, 3, 4 hours a day praying in tongues. And back then, I was still in the Baptist church. They were telling me that everything was of the devil, that it was demon tongues, and I was having to fight thoughts that this is just me, or worse, the devil. And yet I knew it was God, and I just had to keep my finger on the scriptures that says, he that speaks in an unknown tongue edifies himself. And I just forced myself. That's the reason I was praying in tongues hours a day, was to stand in faith and overcome my doubt and unbelief about it. And I was praying in tongues, and anyway, I was praying in tongues one day for a couple of hours at my house over in Arlington, and a guy knocked on the door and came to the door. And when I opened the door, it was a guy that I used to go to church with in a previous Baptist church, and he was standing there and he was crying, and he didn't even say hi. I hadn't seen him in 4 years. He didn't say hi. He didn't do anything. He just walked in and sat down and started crying and just like pouring out all of his problems and telling me everything that was happening. And my first thought when I saw that was, oh man, here's a guy that needs help. I could have been doing something constructive. Instead, I've been speaking in this gibberish. It was my doubts coming up. And then my next thought was, how would I have known to pray for this guy? Hadn't seen him in 4 years. And the Lord spoke to me and He says, this is what you've been praying about for 2 hours. And I was still in the Baptist church. It was real new to me, operating in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. But when I saw that, faith rose, and I just stopped him in mid-sentence. And I said, let me tell you what's going on. And I started telling him what had happened to him and what was going on. And this guy, like I said, hadn't seen me in 4 years. He had never heard of the Holy Spirit, and it scared him. But he knew it was God. And I mean, this man got totally delivered and set free. And through that, I realized, you know what? I was praying for this man. And I began to start realizing that when I would walk and just pray in tongues, you have to do something with your mind. It's not your mind praying when you're praying in tongues. It's your spirit. And so your mind's got to do something. It can't just be switched off, contrary to what some people look like. Your mind is always working. And if you're praying in tongues, if it's truly tongues, your brain's not doing it. So what do you do with your mind? Either your mind's going to be wandering, looking at the lights, looking at the trees, the color of something, thinking about what you're going to have for lunch, or you have to stay your mind on the Lord to really couple it with praying in tongues. And so I would start praying with my understanding while I was praying in tongues. And I'd just spend a couple of hours praying with my understanding mentally while I was speaking in tongues. And I started learning that I would be praying, and all of a sudden people that I hadn't seen in months, years, people that I hadn't thought of, never would have thought of, would come to my mind. And I'd start praying and interceding for them. And then within 24 hours, I'd see that person. And this happened so many times. Even my lightning fast mind began to figure out that, there's something going on here. And when I was praying in tongues, the Holy Spirit was making intercession through me and praying for people. And I began to recognize that God will show you things to come. God will give you revelation. And I pray in tongues a lot.